Her name is Mira. She's 7. Soft-spoken, bright, with the gentlest heart I've ever known. She has these dark, thoughtful eyes that seem to drink in everything around her, like she's storing the world for later. That Saturday afternoon, I pulled into my mother-in-law's driveway, already tense from the memories that house always brought. It was the kind of place that smelled like lemon-scented bleach and judgment, where every shelf was lined with polite, dusty smiles. I wasn't supposed to be early. Camille had told me to give them time to finish lunch before picking Mira up after her sleepover. But I had this feeling, like a stone in my gut. I couldn't wait. I walked up the short steps, every creak of the old wood reminding me of all the times I'd bitten my tongue in that place. I knocked once and let myself in, because Lucinda insisted we were family and didn't need to stand on ceremony. The smell of something overcooked clung to the air. And then I heard it. Myra's small voice, almost too small to catch, like a frightened bird in the walls. My heart thudded. I stepped into the living room and stopped dead. Mira sat on the floor, cradling her arm like it was something precious and broken. Her face was pale, her lips trembling with that brave, silent stoicism kids adopt when they've learned it's safer to hide their pain. Across from her stood Kaysen, my wife's older nephew, arms crossed like he'd just won a game. He was taller than her by a head, all elbows and awkward arrogance. I saw a flash of something mean in his eyes, something I'd ignored before. Lucinda sat in her favorite chair, the one with the lace antimacassar she'd crocheted herself, wearing that glassy smile she reserved for moments when she wanted everyone to pretend things were fine. Her voice was sweet as syrup when she spoke. She must have said something, she chirped, starting to me as though I'd walked in on something private. Boys lash out. Her voice rolled the words like marbles in her mouth, smooth and careless. And then her sister, Sherry, always the echo, piped in from her perch on the arm of the sofa. She needs to apologize. It's how we keep the peace in families. She said it like it was gospel, like the only way to survive a family was to bow to the boys and let the bruises slide. My blood turned cold. I stood there for a second, frozen, looking at Camille, my wife. She was by the mantel, half turned away, eyes downcast like she'd been studying the same stain on the carpet for hours. Her silence said everything. Every time she'd let them push me aside, every time she told me I was overreacting when I saw how they treated Mira. And there was Mira, eyes searching for mine like she'd been waiting for rescue. Her bottom lip quivered. I saw a small tear forming, her arms wrapped tight around herself like armor. My body moved before my brain did. I knelt beside her, feeling the heat of her small frame trembling as I reached out and gently lifted her chin. "Hey," I whispered, my voice as soft as I could make it. "Can I see?" She flinched at first, then nodded. I peeled her arms back carefully. There it was, a bruise darkening her forearm, like an accusation. My vision blurred. I looked at Kaysen, at Lucinda, at Camille. The room felt too small for the rage I felt. Lucinda tutayed. "It's not that bad," she said, leaning forward with a sigh, as if this was just another mess she had to mop up. "Boys will be boys." She probably said something to provoke him. She said it like a judge rendering a final verdict. Like my daughter's pain was a price to keep the family harmony. "Camille," I said, my voice trembling. My wife didn't meet my gaze. She just pressed her lips together and gave the smallest, most useless shrug I'd ever seen. That's when I felt it. A switch. Like something inside me cracked open. I looked at Mira and she looked at me, and in that single, desperate look, I saw all the times I'd let them talk me into waiting, into compromise, into silence. I smiled at her, a real smile, and then I scooped her up into my arms, her small body feather-light against my chest. I felt her clutch at my shirt, her fingers like tiny claws, and I knew she was holding on to me like a lifeline, like she was hoping, just maybe, someone would choose her this time. I didn't say a single word to them, not to Lucinda with her glassy smile, not to Sherry with her judgment, not to Camille with her silence. I just turned and carried Mira out of that house like a knight carrying a princess, though I'd never felt less like a hero in my life. My boots echoed in the hallway, each step a promise that I would never let them pretend this away. I felt their eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I did, I might never leave. Outside, the sun was too bright, the world too real. I opened the passenger door and eased Mira into the seat, buckling her in with trembling hands. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes, God, her eyes were fierce. She looked at me like I was the only one left who could make things right. I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, every step growing heavier with the weight of what I'd just done. But I knew, deep down, I couldn't have done anything else. As I started the car, I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her head was tilted down, but her eyes found mine. And I saw it there: trust, hope, and maybe just a little bit of fear. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew I wouldn't leave her behind. I reached back and rested my hand on her small shoulder. She leaned into my touch, and in that moment, I knew that leaving that house wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning. I didn't say anything on the drive home. Neither did Mira. She sat so still in the passenger seat, her knees drawn up like she was trying to disappear, her eyes unfocused and glazed. I kept glancing over at her, my heart twisting with each mile that ticked by. Every time I opened my mouth to say something, to tell her it would be okay, that we'd figure this out, I couldn't make the words leave my lips. What could I promise her when even I didn't know how to begin? The silence pressed in on us like a third passenger, heavy and unrelenting. I gripped the wheel a little too tight, the leather creaking under my hands, and focused on the road. When we pulled into the driveway, I parked the car and just sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. The house looked like it always did: a neat lawn, a cheerful front porch with a white railing Camille had insisted on. But tonight it felt different, like a barrier I had to cross. I turned to Mira, who was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her small fingers fumbling with the strap. "We're home," I said, my voice too rough. She gave a tiny nod. I opened the door for her and watched her slide out, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. She'd brought it for the sleepover. The bear's fur was worn from years of love, one eye missing, but she held it like a shield. Inside, I tried to make things feel normal. I let her pick a movie, some animated one she'd seen 100 times. And while it played, I went into the kitchen and made her hot cocoa. She liked it with 2 spoonfuls of sugar and a swirl of whipped cream on top, the way my dad used to make it for me when I was little. I remembered how safe I'd felt with that warm mug in my hands, and I hoped she'd feel even a fraction of that. When I brought it to her, she was curled up on the couch, the bear tucked under her chin. Her eyes were red, and she looked so small. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking like old paper. "Of course," I said. I sat down beside her and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She sipped the cocoa in silence, her eyes fixed on the screen, but I knew she wasn't really watching. Her mind was still back there, in that house that smelled like bleach and judgment. After the movie ended, I scooped her up in my arms and carried her upstairs. She was 7, but in that moment, she felt as light as the day I'd carried her out of the hospital, wrapped in a pink blanket with that same hopeful look in her eyes. I ran her a warm bath, checking the temperature 3 times to make sure it was just right. I sat on the bathroom floor while she bathed, humming a little tune, something my mother used to sing to me when I was scared. Mira didn't say much, but every so often, her eyes would flick to mine, and I'd give her a small smile to let her know I was still there. When she got out, I wrapped her in a fluffy towel and dried her hair gently, trying to be careful around her bruised arm. She winced, just a little, but didn't pull away. I helped her into her pajamas, soft cotton with little pink stars, and carried her to her room. That night, as she curled up in her bed, she looked at me with eyes too old for 7 years. "I didn't mean to make trouble," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand, feeling how small and fragile it was in mine. "No, sweetheart," I said, my throat tightening. "You didn't make trouble. You showed me where the trouble really lives." I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her cheek. "You did the right thing," I told her, even though I wasn't sure she believed me yet. I tucked the blanket around her, and she snuggled into it, her bear held tight against her chest. When I turned off the light, I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to her breathing. Every rise and fall was a reminder of how much I'd already failed her by letting those people into her life. But I wouldn't fail her again. I promised myself that. Even if it meant tearing my own life apart, I would protect her from them. I walked to my study and sat down at my desk, the light from the small lamp painting everything in gold. I opened a new notebook and started writing. Every detail, every conversation, the bruise, the silence, the way Lucinda had smiled while Mira sat crying. I documented everything, not just the bruise but the patterns. The way Lucinda always dismissed Myra's tears. The way Camille's voice would go flat and dull when I tried to bring it up. The way Camille had told me to let it go, to not make a scene. The longer I wrote, the more it felt like I was pulling poison from my own veins. It was all there on the page, the evidence I'd ignored for years because I'd been too worried about keeping the family together. I saw the web I'd been trapped in, the dismissals, the gaslighting, the favoritism. It all led back to one thing, Mira being left at their mercy no matter how many times I'd tried to stand up for her before. But this time something had changed in me. The way she'd looked at me, clutching that bear like a lifeline, had awakened something I'd thought was long dead. This time I wasn't letting it go. I would be the father she needed, even if it meant being the man Camille didn't recognize anymore. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and Myra's steady breathing down the hall. I thought of Lucinda's voice, so sweet and so cruel, telling my daughter that she had to apologize for being hurt. My stomach twisted. I wouldn't let them do that to her again. I wouldn't let them teach her that survival meant silence. Not on my watch. Not ever again. I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a mission, a promise, a fire I'd let them smother too many times before. Now it burned bright and hot inside me, and I knew that I wouldn't rest until Mira could walk into that house and know that no one would ever hurt her again. Camille tried to play it down, tried to twist it into something it wasn't, like she always did. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. She said Kaysen was just a rough kid, that boys hit and push sometimes, that Mira was sensitive. Sensitive. That word felt like a slap. I stared at her, wondering how she could be so calm, so practiced in her avoidance of the truth. She'd spent years excusing her family's worst behaviors, smoothing over bruises with platitudes and shoving the blame onto the smallest, quietest among us, Mira. Just a misunderstanding, she said, her voice like glass. You know how Kaysen can be. He's always been high energy. Her hand trembled on the rim of the mug. She took a breath. Mira can take things too personally. She's a sweet girl, but she's 7, I cut in, my voice sharp, more forceful than I'd intended. But I couldn't take it back, and I didn't want to. The room went still. She looked at me like I just cursed at her in a foreign language. She's 7, Camille, I repeated, softer now, but just as firm. She's a child. And you're telling me that it's her fault he hit her? That she should toughen up? Camille's mouth worked silently, her lips forming half-words, excuses that didn't quite land. I saw it then, her guilt, her fear, all tangled up with the same old loyalty to a family that had never shown her real love. I'd watched that dynamic my whole marriage. The way she'd shrink around her mother, the way she'd nod along when Lucinda criticized Myra's dramatic side, the way she'd hush Myra's tears in the car on the drive home, whispering that family meant forgiveness, that you didn't make waves. I pushed the chair back and stood. I couldn't sit there, letting her try to minimize what happened. I've already called Brina, I told her. Her eyes went wide, the kind of wide that said she thought I was overreacting, that I was the one blowing this up. But I wasn't. Not this time. We're pressing charges, I said, letting each word sink in like a nail. We're not letting this go. Against your nephew? She gasped, her face pale. I almost laughed, like it was unthinkable that a child could be held accountable for hurting another child. Like it was unthinkable that the adults who let it happen could be held responsible too. This is going to tear everything apart, she said, her voice trembling. Do you really want that? Do you really want to start a war? Camille, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but feeling the tremor in my chest. I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing something that should have ended a long time ago. I leaned on the table, my hands braced on the worn wood, my eyes locked on hers. I'm doing what you should have done. Protecting our daughter. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but no words came. She just stared at me, her eyes filling with tears she didn't want me to see. For a second, I thought she might actually understand. But then she blinked, and the mask snapped back into place. She crossed her arms, her posture rigid. And if I don't agree, she asked, her tone icy. Then you're just as guilty, I said. The words hit the air like a gunshot. She recoiled, but I didn't soften it. You let it happen, Camille. You knew about that closet last summer. You told me it was no big deal. And now Myra's sitting here with a bruise on her arm, and you're telling me to let it go. My voice broke, anger and pain mixing into something raw. I'm done letting it go. I called Brina Toller, our lawyer, that same afternoon. She was an old friend from college, tough as nails and loyal to the end. She'd once told me, half joking, that I'd never need her services because I was too decent a guy to get into trouble. When I told her what happened, I could almost hear her jaw clench on the other end of the line. "Send me everything," she said. "Photos, statements, anything. I'm on this. And we're not going to let them hide behind family excuses." Her confidence steadied me. I took photos of Myra's bruise, documented the time and date, and typed out a detailed statement, every word a step closer to justice. That evening, I called Myra's school therapist, Miss Desai. She'd always had a soft spot for Myra. Said she was the brightest kid she'd ever met, with a knack for picking up on other people's moods. When I told her about the bruise, her voice was tight but calm. "She's been drawing some dark, concerning things for weeks," she said. My heart sank. A closet with no handle, a boy with red fists, a woman laughing from a living room. The details matched too well, and the bile rose in my throat. "I should have seen it sooner," Miss Desai said, her voice cracking a little. "I'll get everything documented. We'll back you up." After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. The house was quiet, too quiet. Camille had retreated to the guest room, the door closed. I imagined her there, crying or maybe just staring at the ceiling, trying to decide which side she was on. I wanted to go to her, to pull her back to the woman I'd married, the woman who'd once held Myra in her arms and promised to protect her. But that woman had learned to obey the silence, to keep the family peace. I didn't know if she could unlearn it. I didn't know if I wanted her to try. I closed my eyes and pictured Myra's face, so small, so brave. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up, worrying about her being too quiet, too watchful, too eager to please. I thought about the times she'd hidden behind the couch when Lucinda's voice got sharp, how she'd flinched when Sherry's laughter turned mean. I thought about the closet, the drawings, the bruise. I thought about Camille, standing by and saying nothing. My jaw tightened. This time, I wasn't backing down. I wasn't letting them call her sensitive or dramatic or any of the other words they used to dismiss her pain. I'd spent too many years being the quiet one, the one who kept the peace. But now? Now I was the father who would stand between her and every monster in that house, even if the monsters wore pearls and polite smiles. I picked up my phone and texted Brina. "We're moving forward," I wrote. My finger hovered for a moment. Then I added, "No mercy." 2 days after I left with Myra, the first call came through, and I knew that everything was about to change. It was a Sunday morning, and I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the grass like it might give me answers. Myra was inside, working on a puzzle with her stuffed bear beside her. I could hear her humming under her breath, soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be happy yet. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with Lucinda's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her excuses, not after everything I'd documented, every lie I'd memorized. But she didn't leave it there. Within minutes, Camille's phone lit up too, a shrill tone that made me flinch. Camille was in the kitchen, her face drawn and pale, her eyes rimmed with red from nights spent crying or rehearsing excuses. I wasn't sure which. She picked up the phone, and I watched as her face contorted, her mouth a hard line. She held the phone away from her ear like it was hot, Lucinda's voice screeching even from that distance. "She's saying you're tearing the family apart," Camille whispered to me, her voice trembling. "She's saying you're overreacting, that Myra's always been dramatic." She paused, her eyes searching mine for something she could cling to, something she could use to keep the peace. "She says you're trying to ruin everything." I wanted to tell her I didn't care, that Lucinda's words meant nothing to me anymore. But a part of me still felt the old weight of keeping Camille calm, of trying to hold our marriage together with tape and prayers. "You know that's not true," I said instead, my voice soft but firm. "You know why we're doing this." She closed her eyes and nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She'd always been Lucinda's daughter, trained to bow and smile. But now she was caught in the middle, and I didn't envy her. I just wished she'd pick a side. An hour later, the second call came. This time from Lucinda's HOA president, of all people, a man named Mr. Crowley with too much time on his hands and a penchant for neighborhood drama. "I'm hearing some concerning things," he said, his tone heavy with false concern. "About you and Myra. About the police. Is everything all right?" His voice was like oil on water, smooth and untrustworthy. I told him nothing, thanked him for his concern, and hung up. But I knew the gossip had started. I knew Lucinda had wasted no time spinning her own version of events. It would spread like wildfire, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. I thought it couldn't get worse, but then came the knock on the door. A slow, deliberate sound that made my stomach drop. I opened it to find a woman standing there, a badge clipped to her belt and a folder in her hands. She introduced herself as Ms. Carter from the Family Law Investigator's office. Her eyes were kind but sharp, like she'd seen too many families like mine. "We've had a report," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "We need to ask you a few questions about your daughter." I invited her in, my heart thudding in my chest like a war drum. She sat on the couch, her notebook open, and started with the basics. Names, dates, relationships. I answered every question with precision, my voice steady, even though my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles were white. She asked about the bruise, about Myra's behavior, about the night I'd taken her home. I showed her the photos I'd taken, the drawings Mira had made. Dark sketches of a closet with no handle, a boy with red fists, a woman's cold smile. She studied them in silence, her pen hovering over the page. "And what about your wife's family?" she asked finally. "Do you feel they pose a risk to Mira?" The question was like a knife. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely." She made a note, her eyes flicking up to mine. "We'll need to speak to Mira," she said. "And your wife." I hesitated. Camille was already so fragile, torn between loyalty to her mother and the reality of what had happened. "I'll make sure she's available," I said, though I wasn't sure that was a promise I could keep. Ms. Carter closed her folder and stood. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said. "We'll be in touch." I saw her out, my mind spinning with the weight of everything that was happening. I turned to see Mira standing at the end of the hall, her eyes wide. She didn't ask any questions, just clutched her bare to her chest like a lifeline. I knelt down and opened my arms, and she ran to me, burying her face in my shoulder. That night, the walls of the house seemed to close in on us. Camille sat in the living room, staring at her hands. I could see the war inside her, between the mother she wanted to be and the daughter she'd always been. "They're going to hate me," she said finally, her voice a brittle whisper. "They're going to call me a traitor." I shook my head. "You're not a traitor," I said. "You're a mother. You're her mother, and she needs you more than they ever did." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know how." I wanted to tell her it wasn't about knowing how. It was about choosing to try. But I didn't have the strength to say it. I just held her hand and let the silence fill the spaces between us. Outside, the world kept turning. Lucinda was spinning her web, painting me as the villain, Mira as the liar. I knew it wouldn't stop there. Sherry would post her passive-aggressive quotes online, all about forgiveness and family unity, while behind the screen she'd be sharpening her knives. I could almost hear the whispers, the judgment, the thin-lipped smiles. But I didn't care. Not anymore. Because inside this house, with my daughter's drawings spread across the table and my wife's tears soaking the carpet, I knew where the truth lived, and I was done letting them bury it under their polite lies. When I tucked Mira into bed that night, she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something she couldn't name. "Daddy," she said, her voice trembling, "will they be mad at me?" My heart broke. I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong. You told the truth. And that's the bravest thing anyone can do." She closed her eyes, her small body relaxing against the pillow. I watched her breathe, watched her chest rise and fall, and I made another silent promise. No matter what came next, I would stand between her and the monsters, even if the monsters were the ones who called themselves family. The worst part wasn't the bruise itself, though it burned in my memory like a fresh brand every time I closed my eyes. It wasn't the silence in the car or the cold cup of coffee I'd left untouched on the kitchen counter that morning. No, the worst part came 2 nights later, when Mira finally let me in on a secret she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest. We were sitting on her bed. She in her pajamas, her hair still damp from the bath, the air around us heavy with the scent of soap and the ghost of old tears. She held her bear close, the one she'd named Mr. Teddy, and her thumb rubbed a worn patch on its ear the way she always did when she was trying to be brave. "Daddy," she said, her voice so small I had to lean in to hear. "I want to tell you something, but I don't want to get in trouble." My heart seized, and I reached for her hand, careful not to startle her. I'd learned that sometimes comfort could be a quiet hand, a steady presence, not a flood of questions. "You won't get in trouble, honey," I said, my voice calm but firm. "No matter what it is, you can tell me. Always." She nodded, her eyes big and serious, and then she took a shaky breath. "It's about the closet," she whispered, the words stumbling over each other. I felt my stomach drop. The closet. The drawings she'd made at school, the ones Miss Desai had shown me, each one darker than the last. I tried to piece it together, but hearing her say it, that was different. That was real. "What about the closet?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was racing. She pressed her lips together, tears welling up in her eyes. I squeezed her hand gently, waiting. I'd learned that with Mira, you didn't rush the truth. You let it come on its own time. "Last summer," she said, her voice trembling, "Kaysen locked me inside. I didn't do anything, Daddy. I was just playing with my dolls. He said I was annoying." A tear slipped down her cheek. I felt a white-hot anger bloom in my chest, but I swallowed it down, focusing on her. "He pushed me inside and shut the door. It was so dark, Daddy. I couldn't get out." Her voice cracked. I banged on the door, and I screamed, but Lucinda was laughing in the living room. She didn't come. I closed my eyes for a second, picturing it. My little girl, alone in the dark, her small fist pounding on the door while that woman, my wife's mother, laughed like it was all a game. The rage rose up so strong I thought I might choke on it, but I forced it down, because Mira didn't need my anger. She needed my strength. "How long were you in there?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I don't know," she whispered. "A long time. I cried a lot. I tried to be quiet so he'd let me out, but he didn't. He only let me out when Lucinda said it was time for dinner." I felt my jaw clench so tight it hurt. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Myra's hand was still in mine, small and warm, and I focused on that. "Did you tell Mommy?" I asked finally, though I knew the answer before she said it. She nodded, her eyes wide and solemn. She said it wasn't a big deal. She said boys can be mean sometimes and that I should be nicer so he'd like me. My chest constricted. I looked at her and saw every time Camille had brushed off my concerns, every time she'd told me to give her family a chance, every time she'd said I was imagining things. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She shook her head, her little brow furrowed. "It's not your fault, Daddy," she whispered. "You didn't know." I pulled her into my arms then, holding her so tight I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, and made a silent promise to her and to myself I would never let them lock her away in the dark again. When I finally let her go, she curled up on her pillow, her bare pressed to her chest, and I stayed with her until her breathing evened out, until I was sure she'd found sleep. I sat there in the half-light, the shadows from the hallway stretching across the floor like old scars. I thought about Camille, how she'd sat at that kitchen table and told me it was a misunderstanding, how she'd defended Kaysen with that tired, practiced tone. I thought about Lucinda's glassy smile, the way she dismissed Myra's tears with a wave of her hand. And I realized I wasn't fighting a boy. I was fighting a culture. A legacy of silence that had been passed down like a family heirloom, polished and displayed at every holiday dinner. I walked down the hall to my study and opened my notebook again. I wrote down everything Mira had told me, every word, every detail. I wrote about the closet with no handle, the laughter from the living room, the dinner that came after. I wrote about the way Camille had brushed it off, how she'd chosen to keep the peace instead of protecting our daughter. The pen dug into the page so hard it almost tore, but I didn't care. I needed the record. I needed the proof. Because this time, no one would silence her. No one would silence me. When I finished, I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, but I knew it wasn't over. I knew Lucinda would fight back, that she'd spin her stories, that Camille's family would circle their wagons and call me the traitor. But I didn't care. Not anymore. Because Myra's truth was bigger than their lies, and I'd finally found the strength to stand up for it. For her. I turned off the light and walked back to her room. I stood in the doorway and watched her sleep, her face soft and peaceful, her bear tucked under her chin. She looked so small in that big bed, but she'd shown me a strength I hadn't known a 7-year-old could carry. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just fighting for her. I was fighting for every girl who'd ever been told to stay quiet, to be small, to be sorry for the harm done to them. I'd never let her shrink again. not while I was still breathing. By the time Camille and I found ourselves in separate rooms, the house didn't even feel like ours anymore. It was like a museum of memories I couldn't trust. The photos on the wall of Myra's kindergarten graduation, the little art project stuck to the fridge. Even the smell of Camille's perfume in the hallway felt like a lie now, a scent that belonged to someone who'd stood by while her family broke our daughter's trust. We hadn't slept in the same bed for days, each of us gravitating to a different corner of the house, like two strangers living under the same roof because the rent was cheaper that way. One night, I found her sitting in the guest room, the door half open, the light from the hallway slanting across her face. She looked so small, hunched over with her elbows on her knees, her hands trembling. I stood there for a moment, watching her in the half-dark, remembering all the times I'd come home late and found her reading on the couch, smiling like I was her safe place. Now, that smile was gone. The safe place had been burned to the ground. When I finally stepped inside, she didn't look up at first. "You didn't even ask how I felt," she said, her voice brittle, like glass ready to shatter. It stopped me cold. I'd spent so long focusing on Mira, on the evidence, on the pain. I hadn't even thought to ask how Camille was holding up. But then I remembered that night in Lucinda's house, when she'd stood by and let her mother call Mira dramatic, when she'd let her nephew lock my daughter in a closet. "I did ask," I said quietly. "For 7 years. Every time they said something, every time she came home with a story, I asked you to stand up for her. And you didn't. You just didn't like the answer." She flinched, her eyes closing as the tears fell. "I thought I was keeping the peace," she whispered. "I thought if I just stayed quiet, it would go away." I shook my head. "It doesn't go away, Camille. It grows. And now it's grown so big it's standing between us and our daughter." I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to hurt her. But I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep hoping she'd change. I couldn't let Mira think silence was love. So I called Brina again. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm and no nonsense as always. "I need the custody papers," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "I'm not trying to take Mira away from her mother, but I can't let that house near her again." Brina was quiet for a moment. "You're doing the right thing," she said, "even if it feels like you're tearing your life in two." I knew she was right. Because the truth was, my life had already been torn in two the moment I saw Mira holding her arm, the moment Camille didn't step in to stop it. When I told Camille, she looked at me like I'd stabbed her. "You're taking her away from me?" she cried. "After everything? After I said I'd change?" Her voice was ragged, but I couldn't let it sway me. "I'm not taking her away," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "I'm giving her a chance to heal. I'm giving you a chance to decide who you want to be. Because right now, you're stuck between them and her. And that's not fair to anyone." She sobbed then, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. I wanted to hold her. I wanted to tell her we'd get through it. But I couldn't. Not when Mira was depending on me to be the parent who didn't flinch. Not when I was the only one who'd drawn the line in the sand. I stayed in the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest like a shield. "You have a choice, Camille," I said softly. "You can stand with your daughter, or you can stand with the legacy of silence you were raised in. But you can't do both." She looked up at me then, her eyes red, her lips trembling. "I don't know if I can choose," she whispered. "They're my family. They're all I've ever known." I shook my head, my own tears threatening. "Then you're going to lose her," I said, "because I won't let her grow up thinking she's not worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between us, a final sentence in a conversation we'd been having for years without ever saying it out loud. I turned and walked away, my chest tight. In the hall, I leaned against the wall, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought about Mira, asleep in her bed, her small hand clutching Mr. Teddy like a lifeline. I thought about the promise I'd made her, that I'd never let her face the monsters alone. And I knew that even if it cost me my marriage, even if it cost me the last shreds of the life I'd built, I had to keep that promise. Because she was mine to protect. And I'd already let her down once. Never again. Lucinda launched her counterattack with the precision of a general who'd been planning for years. I should have known it would come. The moment I took Mira out of that house, the moment I chose to fight for her, I painted a target on my back that Lucinda would never ignore. It started small, snide comments on social media, whispered gossip at the school gates, her friends giving me those thin-lipped, sympathetic smiles that weren't sympathy at all. But it escalated quickly. She filed a defamation suit, calling me a liar, and a manipulator who'd poison Mira against her own family. She called me an abuser, a controlling father who'd kidnapped his own daughter. The words made me sick, but I'd expected them. What I didn't expect was how fast it would all spin out of control. Lucinda knew people in this town. She'd lived here her whole life, sat on committees, hosted charity luncheons, built a network of allies who owed her favors or feared her disapproval. I saw the way the neighbors turned their backs when I walked Mira to school. The way Mrs. Talley, who used to bring us cookies every Christmas, couldn't meet my eyes anymore. Even the principal's handshake felt colder. But I didn't care about the neighbors. I cared about Mira. And every time I saw her eyes flinch when we walked past Lucinda's house, every time she shrank into herself when someone mentioned her cousin's name, my resolve only grew stronger. What Lucinda didn't count on was Miss Desai. Myra's therapist was a force of nature, calm, yes, but sharp as a blade. She'd seen enough in her line of work to know when a child was telling the truth. She stepped forward without hesitation. I have observed significant behavioral distress in Mira, particularly after weekends at her grandmother's, she wrote in her report. Her drawings and her statements corroborate the psychological harm she has experienced. She didn't mince words, and I could have hugged her for it. But even that wasn't enough to quiet Lucinda. She doubled down, spreading rumors at the PTA meetings, telling everyone I was unstable, that I'd always been too strict with Mira, that she'd always known I was the type to make things up for attention. And then there was Mr. Blight, Kaysen's teacher. He'd always seemed like the type to avoid conflict, but when I called him and told him what had happened, he surprised me. I can't say I'm shocked, he said, his voice low and tired. Kaysen has trouble controlling aggression toward his female classmates. We've had multiple incidents. He agreed to put it in writing, to testify if it came to that. I thanked him, feeling like I'd found an unexpected ally in the trenches. Because every time Lucinda opened her mouth to smear me, I knew there were others who had seen the truth too. But the final nail in her carefully constructed coffin came from an unexpected place, a neighbor's door camera. The footage was grainy, but the sound was as clear as a confession. You could hear Mira crying from the other side of Lucinda's house, her small voice shaking with fear. And then, sharp as a knife, came that cold adult voice, Lucinda's voice, saying, "Just apologize and stop being dramatic." The first time I heard it, my stomach turned. I played it again and again, each time feeling a fury I didn't know I was capable of. It was the proof I'd been waiting for, the truth I'd felt in my bones but couldn't show anyone until now. I took the footage straight to Brina. She watched it once, her face impassive, then turned to me with a fire in her eyes. "This changes everything," she said. "She can't talk her way out of this one." She filed it as evidence, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. But Lucinda didn't go down quietly. She called Camille, sobbing into the phone that I was destroying the family, that I'd manipulated Mira, that I'd always been too controlling. I could hear Camille's voice on the other side of the wall as she tried to reason with her, her words weak and uncertain. She still wanted to believe her mother could change, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But I'd stopped believing in Lucinda's redemption a long time ago. That night, Camille came to my room, her face pale and drawn. "She's my mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How am I supposed to just cut her off?" I looked at her, this woman I'd loved for so long, and saw the child in her eyes, the child who'd been taught that love meant silence, that forgiveness meant enduring whatever was thrown at you. "She's your mother," I said, my voice steady. "But she's not Myra's protector. That's our job. And right now, she's the one hurting our daughter. You have to choose, Camille. You can't stand in both worlds forever." She pressed her lips together, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. I reached out and took her hand, my thumb brushing the back of it. "Then I'll stand for both of us," I said. "Because Mira needs someone who won't flinch." The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, therapist sessions, and Myra's quiet strength. Every night, she crawled into bed with Mr. Teddy clutched to her chest and whispered, "Did I do the right thing?" And every night, I told her yes. That telling the truth was the bravest thing a girl could do. That I was proud of her. That she was safe now. Lucinda kept fighting, but the walls were closing in. The neighbors' whispers grew louder, but this time they weren't all in her favor. Some of them remembered seeing Myra's bruises. Some remembered the way Lucinda had always controlled every conversation. One by one, her web started to unravel. And I realized something. Sometimes monsters build their lairs out of politeness and family loyalty, but eventually the truth crawls out. And when it does, even the strongest webs can't hold it back. I tucked Mira in that night and kissed her forehead. She smiled up at me, her eyes sleepy but bright. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft, "you're my hero." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "No, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice thick. "You're the hero. I'm just the man who finally learned to stand up for you." She closed her eyes, her breath evening out as she drifted to sleep. And as I watched her, I knew that no matter how many battles Lucinda fought, she'd already lost the war. Because Mira wasn't alone anymore. And neither was I. The courtroom wasn't big, but the tension felt massive, like it had its own gravity. Every breath I took felt heavier than the last. The walls were the same institutional off-white as every other government building I'd ever set foot in, but today, they seemed to glow with an uncomfortable, buzzing light. I sat at the small table on the left, Brina beside me, her pen clicking rhythmically against her notepad as she prepared. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum. Mira sat next to me, her small hand clutching my sleeve with a force I hadn't realized she had. She wore a navy dress with tiny white flowers, her hair pulled back with a barrette. She'd chosen that barrette herself, insisting it made her look strong. She looked more grown-up than I'd ever wanted her to look. Across the aisle, Lucinda sat in pearls and a gray dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She held her head high, her lips pressed into a thin, controlled smile. Sherry was beside her, arms crossed, eyes full of contempt. Camille sat in the row behind me, a seat apart. She looked like a ghost of the woman I'd married, pale, drawn, her eyes rimmed in red. I'd never seen her look so small. Part of me wanted to reach back, to offer some comfort, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when we were here to protect Mira. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and glasses perched on the tip of her nose, called the room to order. The sound of her gavel cracked through the air like a gunshot. "We are here to determine the veracity of the claims brought forth by Mr. Ellis regarding the safety and well-being of his daughter, Mira Ellis." Her voice was steady, but the weight of every word pressed down on me. Brina leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. This is your truth to tell." The prosecutor called Mira first. My heart clenched. She rose from her seat, her small hand slipping from mine, and walked to the witness stand. Her legs wobbled a little, but she held her chin high, just like we'd practiced. When they asked if she knew why she was here, she looked at me first, her eyes steady. "Because Daddy didn't let me be hurt and quiet anymore," she said, her voice clear, ringing through the room. My throat closed, but I didn't let the tears fall. The judge's eyes softened. Even Lucinda's mask slipped for a moment. Lucinda's lawyer tried to trip Mira up, asking her if maybe she'd misunderstood what had happened, if maybe Kaysen hadn't meant to hurt her. Myra's lip trembled, but she didn't waver. "You shut me in the closet," she said. And grandmother laughed. "And Mommy didn't come." Her voice shook on the last word. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, but I had to let her finish. I had to let her be heard. When she was done, she came back to me, her little body folding into my arms like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, and whispered, "You were so brave, sweetheart." She clung to me like she'd never let go. My hands shook as I held her. Next, Miss Desai took the stand. She spoke with a calm certainty, laying out the evidence like bricks in a wall. "Mira has exhibited signs of trauma consistent with emotional neglect and psychological harm," she said, her voice unwavering. Her drawings, her statements, and her behavior all indicate a deep sense of fear and distrust toward her maternal grandmother's household. She paused, letting that sink in. "She's safe with her father," she said. "She's healing." I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for weeks. Mr. Blight testified next, speaking about Kaysen's aggression issues, how he'd seen them firsthand in the classroom. "He has difficulty controlling his temper," he said, "particularly toward female classmates. It's a pattern." I watched Lucinda's face go pale. She'd built her entire defense on the idea that Kaysen was just a boy being a boy, but here was a teacher saying otherwise. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Then Brina stood. She held up the video from the neighbor's door camera. The judge adjusted her glasses and watched, stone-faced, as Myra's small cries echoed through the courtroom. "Just apologize and stop being dramatic," Lucinda's voice hissed from the screen. The silence afterward was deafening. Lucinda's mask crumbled then, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Hamilton," she said sharply, "you will have your turn." When Lucinda finally took the stand, she tried to spin her story, how she'd only been trying to teach Mira to be strong, how children sometimes needed to learn the hard way. But her voice was shaking, her eyes unable to meet anyone's. "I never meant to hurt her," she said. "Families fight sometimes." The judge's expression hardened. "Locking a child in a closet is not a fight," she said coldly. "It's abuse." Lucinda's shoulders slumped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. When it was Camille's turn, she looked like she might fall apart right there in the witness stand. "I let them hurt her," she whispered. "I thought I was keeping the peace. But I see now that I was just keeping her silent." Tears streamed down her face. "I don't want peace anymore if it means silence," she said. The judge nodded, her gaze softening just a fraction. "Thank you," she said. "That will be all." The judge took a deep breath and looked around the room. "I find that Lucinda Hamilton's household is an unsafe environment for Mira Ellis," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "Custody will remain with Mr. Ellis. Visitation is suspended until further evaluation." The gavel came down with finality, and the room exhaled all at once. I looked at Mira, who was watching me with eyes full of wonder, and I knew we'd done it. We'd stood up. We'd spoken out. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was safe. The day I got the papers, full primary custody, felt like a sunrise after a year of darkness. Camille and I had argued through lawyers and social workers and therapists, but when the final ruling came down, it was quiet. Mira had gone to bed clutching Mr. Teddy, and I'd sat in the living room alone, the weight of the decision settling into my bones like a new gravity. It wasn't that I wanted to keep Mira from her mother. That was never my intention. I just couldn't let that house touch her again. I couldn't let Lucinda's laughter and Kaysen's fists and all those half-truths slip back into our lives like a draft under a locked door. Camille moved out a week later, her things packed into cardboard boxes that seemed too small for a marriage's worth of memories. She didn't say much when she left. Just a quiet, "I'm sorry," that felt like an echo in a cathedral. I stood on the porch, watching her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the evening mist. The house felt hollow, like it had exhaled and had nothing left to give. But then I heard Myra's footsteps padding down the stairs, her small form silhouetted in the hallway. "Daddy," she said, her voice hesitant, fragile. I knelt and opened my arms, and she ran into them like she'd been waiting all her life. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. We didn't talk much that first night. Instead, I made her favorite dinner, mac and cheese with the crusty top and a sprinkle of breadcrumbs, and we sat on the couch, watching the flickering TV screen, her head resting on my shoulder. I felt her breathing slow, the tension melting out of her body. It struck me then how young she really was. Just 7. And yet, she'd been carrying the burden of silence for longer than most adults ever would. I smoothed her hair back and whispered, "It's safe now, sweetheart. You're home." The next morning, I woke up to find her standing in the kitchen, her bare feet pressed into the cold tile, a piece of paper in her hand. "Daddy," she said, holding it out to me. "Can we put this on the fridge?" I took it from her, and my throat tightened. It was a drawing, a tree, big and strong, with a bright green canopy and thick roots digging into the earth. Next to it was a small stick figure with brown hair, arms outstretched. Underneath, in her neat but wobbly handwriting, she'd written "Brave." I blinked hard, fighting tears. "Of course we can," I said, my voice thick. I grabbed a magnet and pressed it to the fridge, right at eye level. "Why did you draw that?" I asked her softly. She looked at me with those wise eyes, too old for her 7 years. "Because that's what you are," she said. "You're my brave tree." I pulled her into my arms and held her so tight I thought I might break her. But she didn't break. She clung to me, her arms around my neck, her small body trembling with something like relief. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you more than all the trees in the world." I kissed her hair and whispered it back. And in that moment, I didn't feel like the man who'd lost a wife. I felt like the man who'd finally found his purpose. We started small, building our life one quiet morning at a time. I learned how to braid her hair, even though I'd always been all thumbs with anything delicate. She'd giggle as I fumbled, telling me I was getting better every day. We planted a real tree in the backyard, an oak, tall and proud, just like the one she'd drawn. She named it Brave, and every day after school, she'd run out and check on it, her small fingers brushing the new leaves like she was blessing them. I'd watch her from the window, my heart swelling with something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Camille started coming around more often, but only with supervision at first. She'd sit on the porch steps, wringing her hands, her eyes darting to me like she was afraid I'd send her away. "I'm trying," she'd say, her voice cracking. "I'm trying to be the mother she needs." I believed her, but I didn't trust her yet. Not completely. I watched every interaction, every word, every touch. But Mira surprised me. She'd run to her mother, hug her tight, then come back to me and say, "Daddy, she's learning. We have to help her." It broke something in me to hear her speak with so much grace, so much forgiveness. She was teaching us both. We started therapy together, me, Camille, and Mira. The first session felt like walking into a minefield. Camille sat on one side of the room, her hands twisting in her lap, while I sat on the other, my arms crossed, my heart pounding. Mira sat between us, her small face turned up to the therapist like she was the only one in the room who truly understood what was at stake. "I want my mommy and daddy to be nice to each other," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Because I love you both, and I don't want to have to choose." My throat tightened, and I reached out, my hand brushing Camille's. She looked at me, her eyes full of tears, and I nodded. "We're going to figure this out," I whispered. For her. Slowly, painfully, we started to talk. About the silence that had lived in our marriage long before Mira was born. About the way Lucinda's voice had shaped Camille's view of family. About the way I'd let my own fears of confrontation keep me quiet for too long. We dug through the rubble together, piece by piece, building something that felt fragile but real. Mira would sit and listen, sometimes offering a word or two that felt like pure wisdom. "Daddy, you can't make mommy good at it right away," she'd say, her voice solemn. "You have to let her try." And I'd smile, even as my heart ached. Because she was right. Healing wasn't instant. It was a million small choices, every day. One Saturday morning, after therapy, Camille stayed for breakfast. Mira wanted pancakes, and I let her help me stir the batter, her small hands covered in flour. Camille watched from the table, her eyes soft, a smile on her lips I hadn't seen in years. "You're good at this," she said, her voice full of something like awe. I shrugged, flipping a pancake. "She makes it easy," I said. Mira grinned, her cheeks pink, and reached over to smear flour on my nose. I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it came from a part of me I'd forgotten existed. Camille joined in, and for a moment, it felt like we were a family again. Not the old family, with its secrets and silences, but something new, something honest. After breakfast, Mira ran outside to check on Brave, and Camille and I stood at the sink, washing dishes side by side. The silence between us wasn't heavy this time. It felt like a space where words might grow. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice small, "for giving me a chance to try." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd once danced barefoot in the kitchen at midnight. "Thank you for showing up," I said. "For her. For yourself." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm going to keep trying," she whispered. "I want to be better." I reached over and squeezed her hand, just once, and she held on like it was the only thing keeping her afloat. That night, after Mira fell asleep with Mr. Teddy tucked under her arm, I stood at her door and watched her breathe. Her face was peaceful, the bruises fading, the darkness receding. I thought about everything we'd survived. The gaslighting, the silence, the bruises that never should have been. I thought about the way Mira had found her voice, how she'd stood up in that courtroom and told the world the truth. I thought about Camille's tears, her halting apologies, her slow steps toward redemption. And I thought about the tree in the backyard, its branches reaching for the sky. Brave. Just like her. Just like us. I went to my own bed and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the past few months pressing on me like a second gravity. But this time, it didn't crush me. It reminded me that I was still standing, that we were still standing. Mira had given me the courage to fight. And in doing so, she taught me that sometimes love means breaking the silence. Sometimes it means planting a tree in the dirt and watching it grow, even when the storms come. Because love isn't about keeping the peace at all costs. It's about standing up, even when it's hard, even when it means losing everything you thought you had. I closed my eyes and drifted off, a quiet smile on my lips. Because for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew exactly who I was. A father who'd learned to choose his daughter every single time. A man who'd found his voice. A man who'd become her home. 2 days can change everything. 2 days ago, I was a silent man in a loud family. The kind of man who tried to keep the peace even when the peace was just a lie that left bruises on a child's arm. 2 days ago, I was a husband who tiptoed around my wife's silences, who tried to understand her mother's manipulations, who bent over backward to be the calm one, the rational one, the man who believed love was about forgiveness no matter the cost. 2 days ago, I was the kind of father who thought that being patient and quiet would fix everything. But not anymore. Now, I'm the father who will never be silent again. They told her to apologize for being hurt. They told her it was her fault. They told her she had to be the one to mend the broken pieces that were never hers to fix. They tried to teach her that the easiest way to survive was to stay quiet, to make herself small, to smile through tears. And for too long, I let them. I let them tell her that keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth. I let them teach her that love meant bowing her head instead of lifting it high. I let them, until she looked at me in that courtroom, her small voice strong and steady, and said, "Daddy didn't let me be hurt and quiet anymore." That was the moment I realized I'd finally become the man she needed me to be. She smiled at me last night, kissed my cheek, and said, "Thanks for picking me up, Dad." Simple words. Soft. But they hit me like a lightning strike. Because I knew what she meant. She didn't just mean the day I carried her out of that house, her arms tied around my neck, her head buried in my shoulder. She meant every day since then. Every morning I'd shown up. Every night I'd tucked her in. Every moment I'd chosen to be her shield instead of her silence. She meant every time I stood up for her when it would have been easier to stand down. I said, always. Because when a girl is hurt, the man who loves her most doesn't ask her to bow. He teaches her to stand. He stands with her, no matter how loud the voices against them. He stands with her when the world tries to tell her she's too small, too soft, too much trouble. He stands with her when she feels alone. He stands with her because that's what fathers do. That's what I never want her to doubt again. I know now that silence is a betrayal all its own. That letting others define your child's worth is the same as giving them a loaded weapon. That love isn't passive, it's fierce. It's loud. It's the unwavering voice that says, "You are enough. You matter. You will never stand alone." 2 days ago, I was the man who let them teach her that silence was safer. Now, I am the man who taught her that being hurt is never a crime. That telling the truth is a victory. That forgiveness is a choice she never has to make just to keep the peace. Tonight, as I watch her sleep, her face relaxed and untroubled, I realize that every fight was worth it. Every sleepless night, every confrontation, every tear. Because she is safe. She is seen. She is strong. And she knows that her father will always stand.